Good evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as you know now, because we are in our 30th consecutive year, I interview writers about their craft, what they're working on, what they've accomplished in the past, what they might be planning for the future. It's a wider net than only writers, however. We have had on sculptors, painters, musicians. So if you have an idea for a writer who might be good for the program or another brand of artist, watch for our address at the end of the show. We'd be glad to get your suggestions. I also want to remind you that this and all the other original programming out of 1623 Studios is a result of cable television. You don't get this with Dish. This is a valuable social community asset, and I want you to stick with the Writer's Block. Tonight, we do have a writer, an accomplished novelist by the name of David Tory. And I am going to hold the book up in just a minute. It is Exploration, the Stanfield Chronicles. And I'd like you, and as I welcome David Tory right now. Welcome to the show, David.
Welcome to yourself. I'm sort of welcoming you to my house here, so it's wonderful.
Yes. Well, thank you for inviting us in. I'm going to very early right now hold up the book. We will later insert a JPEG for clarity. It's a very physically handsome book. And it has in the back, I want to point out, because these were valuable, some maps of New England, continental Europe, and southwestern, well, you can't see the southwestern England, which were very helpful to me. Also a list of prominent characters. There are more than a few characters in the book. It moves right along. This is a historical novel, David, you did, set in the early 17th century.
Yeah.
About a swashbuckler. I don't know how else to describe him. He's sort of
He buckles lots of swashes, yes, right.
Yeah. It reminded me sort of a cross between James Bond and the spy world and maybe Indiana Jones. He has many, many adventures and escapes them all. Where did you get the idea for the Chronicles of Isaac Stanfield?
Well, I started a community foundation way back in 1998. And by 2011, when I retired and handed it on to my successors, I thought I'd write a white paper, as I call it, a research paper on the state of philanthropy in New England. And that's all I intended to do. But I thought that the Puritans might have had something to do with the, what's the right word? The less than charitable nature that we find in some areas of New England. And I thought the Puritan background of giving of myself but not of my wealth might have had something to do with it. And in the process of doing the research, I started finding out about historical facts that I didn't know, and I like history, and I didn't know about. And I talked to some of my more erudite American friends, and they didn't know either, some of the characters and some of the things that happened. And so as I explored more, it was like, pulling a thread from a tapestry. You start pulling and pulling, and then suddenly became quite excited about the fact that there was a story there. There was essentially it was a history, little known history of the beginnings of the settlements in New England. And I thought, and I talked to friends of mine, they said, well, why don't you put together a presentation and offer it to schools or universities or whatever it might be, primarily just as an historical narrative. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, when I was very young, I was brought up in a boarding school in England for young gentlemen, the age of 7 to 13, and had a wonderful library. And in the library, there was an author called G.A. Henty, Henty, who wrote something like 50 or so books at the turn of the 20th century, where a young English lad, participated and observed various major actions in history, primarily the English Empire, the British Empire, but everything going back to Boudicca to right the way up to the Boer War. And it was, to me, I was brought up on this, and it was fascinating. So with that in the back of my mind, I thought maybe I can, given that I was going to cover probably a 20, 30-year period, I need to start with a youngster so he doesn't die before the story ends, and have him as a participant and an observer, and become engaged in the story.
When we meet him, I believe he's 16. Is that right?
Yes, he's 16.
He would still be in high school if you were around.
Well, yeah, remember, in 16 was you're well on in your into your semi-maturity in those days.
I don't think they had the word teenager back then.
No, not at all.
But I want to use what you just mentioned as a segue to some of your own background. Much of the book is set in southwestern England.
Yes.
Weymouth, Dorchester,
Yes.
and the coast. Tell us something about your history, where you were educated, where you were born, and how you got over here to New England.
Oh, right. Well, I'll try and keep it short. I was born in Yorkshire, in England.
Way north.
Way north. I'm a northerner. I'm a White Rose man. I was educated, for the most part, in the south of England, in a boarding school called Haileybury. Left in 1961, I graduated, and then went straight into earning my career in London. And by 1962, I'd been invited to become a computer programmer with an organization called Unilever. And that started my career in computers. By 1970 or so, I was in South Africa working with a computer company. Then I started a company of my own. 71, got married the same year. Height of a major recession in England, which was not a good idea. I mean, the new business, not getting married. And that company, the company I started, was acquired by a Swiss company. I went to, my wife and family went to near Geneva, and then that was acquired by an American company. So I was then moved to Long Island in 1980, Long Island, New York, in 1980. Then in 1988, I was asked to run a software company in Boston. And so moved the family up to Cape Ann area. First of all, Topsfield, and then to Essex. And in 1995, I retired from the computer business and then started getting involved in local philanthropy. My wife had started with some friends the Essex Arts Centre in Lawrence. And a wonderful lady who worked for the Stevens Foundations up in Andover area suggested that I was being idle and not looking after the people that needed looking after. I should get involved in helping nonprofits with my business background. And that morphed into a community foundation, which started in 1998. And then by 2011, as I said, I started thinking about writing more from a non-profit perspective, and that then evolved into the book. And it's going to be a trilogy. I've written the first, obviously it's published. The second's been finished, but it needs to go into the substantial edit. And the third book in the trilogy is still in my mind. I'm plotting it, and we'll complete the trilogy.
Well, I'm amazed that with all that activity, you had time to write and do all the extensive research required for this book. Let's go back to the book now. I'm interested in many things, but the plotting is a serious question for me, because the book moves right along. It starts with a fire, and I don't think there is a page in the entire book, the first of this trilogy, that is in any way slow or not absorbing. It moves right along. It reminds me of some films I've seen, like Ritchie's movies, But anyway, tell me about the plotting and where you got all the storyline for Isaac's adventures.
Yeah, I never went to university. So the idea of research from a literary point of view, going into a library and spending a lot of time going through tomes and such like to find out something, that was, and I had a math background at school. So the literary side of it was not something that I was either accustomed to or used to. I did a lot of writing in the computer business because I was doing a lot of marketing and writing brochures and this sort of thing, but nothing of a fictional nature. But I loved history. And so when I started doing the research, and the research, and if you look behind me, that's the library. Most of that is books that I've bought at secondhand bookstores or on Amazon or wherever else about the time and the history. And the more I read, the more I enjoyed the reading. The other thing which was incredible was surfing on Wikipedia. God knows how researchers did research before the internet came along. You can sit at your computer and you can spend hours going down all sorts of rabbit holes and coming up with all sorts of wonderful ideas and jotting them down for future ideas, but still trying to concentrate on what went on and establishing, and then from the books, looking at the bibliography, finding out how they had received their information, and then going back out and checking on that. I mean, it's a wonderful research process, so that the journey became all absorbing. And at some stage, people would say, well, are you going to write all this down? And it was almost say, well, must I? I'm having too much fun doing the research. But the basic research was there. The history is, to me, is compelling because there was so much more than just the Puritans going to Plymouth. There was all the other activity that went on. And as I researched, I said, well, why did they do this? What was the background to this? Who invested so much? But it certainly wasn't the king or the government. It was private people essentially being driven by various whether obligations or commercial interests or whatever they might be. The intrigue, the political intrigue, the commercial activities, the economic and so on. All of these things added up to a mishmash of cross fertilizing ideas and concepts and thoughts and actions. So when I started writing it all down, luckily I had good editors. So the book was actually, at one stage, the book was about 900 pages.
It's down.
Down some, yeah.
Down
but a lot of
down to about 400.
Yeah, that's right. Well, but the reason it goes along quite happily is that someone's persuaded me to say, well, look, are you writing a history textbook, or you're writing a compelling story involving a compelling individual and the coming of age of that individual, Isaac Stanfield, and the people he meets? You've got to decide what is it you're trying to do. Because if you're writing a history, then Isaac gets in the way. If you're trying to write a compelling story of coming of age and trying to get across the ideas behind what happened, then you've got to cut out some of the history. And so I set up a website, davidtoryauthor.com, which contains some of the stuff that I cut or had cut out of the book. Those are the historical background to what was going on. I mean, I got very intrigued by La Rochelle, and I had to cut a lot of that out. La Rochelle,
the first sailing trip that Isaac takes is to La Rochelle, and he's back there frequently.
That's right.
And
La Rochelle is important. La Rochelle is an important part of the history because that was a Huguenot city that was basically a commercial center for goods of all sorts of nature, product coming out of produce coming out of North America through the Basques and the Huguenot traders and such like, going into La Rochelle and then feeding the importers in the West Country of England, Plymouth and Weymouth and Bristol and places like that. And when the problem between La Rochelle as a Huguenot Protestant city in a very Catholic country, France, came to a boil between the king and La Rochelle as a semi-independent organization, city. there was then a threat to this trade that was coming through La Rochelle from North America. And that was one of the reasons why people started paying much more attention in England for direct trade with America or involvement with America, just one of them. And so that's why La Rochelle features in that process.
Now, was it the national conflict and the religious conflict that led you to the spy elements of the
Yeah,
book?
I think that yeah, the spy element was a natural outcome of the somewhat divided loyalty between Reverend John White, who was called the father of Massachusetts, and Sir Ferdinando Gorges, the Plymouth fort captain or governor, who was called the founder of Maine. And it was the fact that Isaac was caught between the two of them ultimately ended up in being considered, or considering himself to be a bit of a spy, and was therefore had crises of consciences or conscience occasionally about who was he actually being loyal to or being disloyal to. So there was an issue there too.
This, in addition, now Isaac travels a great deal. He goes along the southern coast of England. He goes to the continent. He goes eventually to Monhegan and the New World.
Yes.
And there is, I should not neglect the fact that there is also an exquisite love story involved.
Yes.
He and Abigail Baker. I've got to watch myself to not reveal any spoilers here. There is a nice love story that parallels with a lot of traveling absences, Isaac's adventures. What made you decide to take him, because you didn't necessarily have to take him to the New World?
Well, ultimately, it's about the New World. Although the first book is set very much, and the second book set very much, the base is England, because this is where it all started from. Ultimately, what was actually happening in America, in New England, became increasingly important. For example, I think there's a fascinating bit of history, which was actual history, was that the Indians, that, as I call them, the Native Americans, were being brought back to England to be essentially to be educated, to become guides and translators and aids to further exploration in New England. And this is very well documented if you look deeply enough into the process. And they become absolutely critical to the opening up of New England. And people didn't realize this. But in order for that to work, Isaac not only had to meet these people in England, and they were in England, he had to participate in and be part of what they were dealing with when they went back to their own native countries, so to speak. So it was natural, that process of exploration. And also, we needed to give a better a bird's eye view of what was actually going on in New England, so that could be reported back to the people who were interested in developing New England for whatever reasons. And so Isaac became a very useful sort of camera, if you like. He did a sort of photo shoot, and he came back and said, well, this is what's happening.
Yes. I wanted to mention the style. This is called the Chronicles. It's really a journal, almost an epistolary kind of novel, with entries in the journal, very much like letters to his friends, and so it's told from his first person.
Yes.
And becomes very kind of hands-on, realistic descriptions of events because of that. What made you decide on that style instead of an omniscient, distant narration?
I wanted to make it immediate. I wanted to make people to feel that Isaac was actually experiencing something, and he was talking about it as he experienced it. I felt that if it was in the third, in fact, I was advised by one editor to make it third person, make it essentially a descriptive, but as in a third person, so that you could step back from it and you wouldn't necessarily know what was happening next, because the person who was experiencing the adventure wasn't actually telling it, therefore you knew what was going to happen, the fact was going to survive, whatever it might be. And against that, it was the need, I wanted the immediacy of saying, this is what's happening and this is what I'm experiencing. And I hate to say it, is that I found as a writer, putting myself into the persona, if you like, of Isaac, when I was actually writing this novel, I wouldn't know what was going to happen next. I mean, obviously the historical context was all there, but I didn't necessarily know what was next, because Isaac was inhabiting me, or I was inhabiting Isaac, and Isaac was telling me a story, and I was saying, oh, that's interesting. So a lot of it was sort of like a spontaneous process of development of the character.
I've heard that from other writers, that it's at one point or at points during the process, it becomes almost a form of automatic writing. And
Yes.
you are this vessel for the spirit
Yes.
of the character.
Yes.
And it felt
This
like that.
This is who I would have liked to have been, yes.
I was going to mention Abigail again, but maybe I shouldn't go near Abigail. I do want to say that you did get a good deal of suspense across that you said might be gained by an omniscient narrator, and not really easy to create from a journal's point of view. But you do have these mysterious lapses. Isaac is about to get married at one point, and then all of a
Now you're
sudden,
getting into a spoiler alert here.
all of a sudden there's this amnesia period, and later of discovery, which is very suspenseful. You, what the hell is happening? And you have to pay.
Well, this is interesting, because at one stage I was thinking about publication, and it's very difficult for a new author to have a book published, and that's a whole different story. But in the exploration of how I could publish the book, I went to various indie sources, independent publishing sources, and they said, well, you really don't want to write a book more than about 60, 70,000, 80,000 words, which is what, about 180, 200 pages. And I had, by that stage, was up into the sort of 700 or 800s. I cut that down, and I said, well, all right, well, by the time I ended up with a reasonable sized first book, it was 450 pages, whatever it is, and they said, well, now you really ought to have 2 books. So I actually ended up writing 2 books, part 1 and part 2. And then I thought the separation between part 1 and part 2, it doesn't work as 2 separate books. It follows on, although there's obviously an interesting lapse, if you like, it does follow directly on. And so I said, to hell with it. This book only works as, okay, 2 parts, but 1 book. But the original intent was that I was going to write 6 books, but I've actually ended up, I'm writing 3.
You have this divided into 2 parts, although the chapter sequences don't begin again.
No. I wanted to make sure people recognize it was continuity.
Yeah. I always make sure I always make sure I ask my writers, for the benefit of our audience who are writers themselves or dreaming of being writers, how long this process took you from the beginning of the idea and the first word on the page, well, not the first word, the research before the first word, to having a copy of the book in your hand. What was that length of time?
About 7 years.
7 years.
Mm.
That's for the first book, and
No, but I'd largely finished the second book by then.
So that's 2 books.
Yeah, because the basic research took probably 2 or 3 years of just. Actually, probably the research probably even started a little bit before then. But if I go back to my Google Docs and this sort of thing, 2013 was the time that paper was. I was beginning to flesh out the actual story. During
that long research period, did you have times thinking or wondering what am I doing here? This is
No,
endless.
it didn't start as a book. It started again. Well, apart from doing the research for philanthropy, it was almost as putting a curriculum together to go to. And I was involved with Salem State University, and they were kind enough to give me an honorary doctorate and I thought, well, I can tie into that and go and present to a class the history that I've found.
Tell us again, where was the honorary doctorate?
The what, sir?
Where was the honorary doctorate?
Salem State University. It was my connection basically to go back into the university. I thought this was a way in, so I could go and I love talking. I'm a frustrated actor, and I like being on a stage, and the idea of presenting the history in some sort of user friendly way was part of the evolution of a historical text into a story.
It's interesting you said you're a frustrated actor, because much of the book is very dynamic. It's very stage worthy or screen worthy. There's a lot of motion, there's interaction, they're fighting, they're riding horses. His wonderful horse, Maddie.
Oh yes.
One of his many girlfriends.
Yeah.
It moves, and I mean that in the movie sense. It's a motion novel in many ways.
I think again, I'm trying to create immediacy. When you're into a sort of a first-person narrative, you're tending to speak to and with people, and therefore the script, if you like, is a very natural outcome, I think, of a first-person narrative.
Tell me something about the editing process, and also if you have any advice on people watching, thinking of beginning a similar project.
I'm just remembering all the sort of ups and downs of that. The editing process, first of all, you can't have a lot of ego. Priceless bits of priceless. I mean, my just an aside, my brother, no longer with us, was a very good actor. He was at Royal Shakespeare Company, and he was at RAD. And my daughters were involved with. My daughter was involved with a friend in a local theatre up in over here. And at some stage or other, because they were working during the summer and they didn't do anything in the winter, I said, "Why don't you do pantomime, English panto?" I don't know whether you know.
Yeah, I've been to many.
All right. Well, I became the resident dame of all the pantos, which is the comic character dressed up as a woman, and this process. And my brother came. One of his visits was invited to participate as a very famous former actor and director. But he was caught up in panto, being an English actor. I mean, he was kept throwing lines and lines and lines. And it reached the point that when we got to a sort of an early dress rehearsal where we were running about half an hour too long, and basically a huge number of lines were cut, all of which were his. And it's the first, all the lines he'd fed me and other actors, which he thought were absolute gems from his background. And he became very emotional about it. And it's the first time I've really seen him as a prima donna, having all his lines cut. And it was a very good education for me that really the show must go on. If the book is, if you like a particular line and someone else doesn't like it, well, then that line's got to go.
Yeah, I've been there myself.
That's that process. But I first of all, because I still wasn't quite sure whether this book was going to be published in England or it was going to be published at all, the editing process was to go back to a professional editor and say, does this have literary merit?
Yes, yes.
Is this worth pursuing? So part of the edit process was for them to read it and say either yes or no. And if it was yes, what were the conditions under which it was an acceptable literary piece? And so it wasn't so much a sort of basic copy edit. It was much more a structural, substantial edit, as they call it, sub-edit of the process. And that took quite a long time. And that was with an English editor who was a professor of English in a university in England, who I found through the internet. And then once I'd understood that the structure of and he was the one that suggested I do it in the third person as well. So I started rewriting it, and then I found it just didn't work. And then I decided it was going to be an American published book, and I went to an American publisher, and that's where it became much more dealing with the fine-tuning the book.
I have to be a bit of an editor myself.
Yeah.
I was watching the clock.
Oh.
We're almost out of our
Oh my God, sorry.
quick half-hour interview. I've enjoyed this very much, David Tory.
Okay, thank you.
I enjoyed it reading very much Exploration, Stanfield Chronicles, and I can highly recommend it to all of our viewers. Thank you again, David.
Oh, pleasure. Delighted. Thank you.
I'd like to thank you in our TV audience as well. If you've learned something about 17th century adventures from David Tory in his book, Exploration, I want to get the Stanfield, I almost said the Stanfield Chronicles, then the Writer's Block has done its job. Thanks for being with us, and I hope to see you again next week on the Writer's Block. Good night.